In the late 1960s, a truly insane rumor spread throughout college campuses across the United States. Paul McCartney was dead, and not only that, he was replaced with a look-alike, or clone as some would call it today. In January 1967, Britain experienced treacherous weather conditions, and a rumor circulated that Paul McCartney was involved in a car accident where his vehicle skidded on ice and crashed into a pole. This incident allegedly killed him at the height of his career. At the time, a Beatles fan magazine stated, "The 7th January was very icy, with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway, linking London with the Midlands, and towards the end of the day, a rumor swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St. John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself. So, the fanzine tried to bury the rumors there and then. However, this theory had taken on a life of its own and gradually spread from person to person. Later that year, the Beatles released their iconic album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, as well as the Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack. They then released the White Album the following year, and Paul McCartney was regularly releasing music as part of the Beatles, so you would think that this rumor would surely be put to bed. But bizarrely enough, the rumor didn't die, but escalated into something truly insane. The conspiracy now was that Paul McCartney died in the car crash, but the rest of the Beatles decided that they would continue the group and replace him with a look-alike. And the other members were so guilty about doing this that they left clues in all of their albums. By the fall of 1969, the rumor had traveled across the pond and was now the topic of conversation on college campuses across the US. Richard Topher from Columbia Journalism Review remembers the phenomenon and said, "I remember well, at age 12, furiously debating the question of whether Paul was or was not dead in my middle school corridor. My wife says she and her friends were all completely convinced. There were so many clues, and Paul had aged quite a bit from the 24-year-old at the time of his last tour date, not to mention his having married someone they didn't even know he was dating. It was something told at student parties and was eventually heard by a 19-year-old student named Tim Harper, who was studying at Drake University in Des Moines. He was also the sports editor for the college newspaper and decided to write about the Paul is dead conspiracy theory. Then on September 17th, the theory was finally out in black and white. The Drake Times-Delphic published, "Is Beatle Paul McCartney Dead?" Harper pieced together clues he heard from other people and wrote this purely for entertainment purposes. In fact, he didn't even own any Beatles records. The article said, "Lately on campus there's been so much conjecture on the present state of Beatle Paul McCartney. An amazing series of photos and lyrics on the group's albums point to a distinct possibility that McCartney may indeed be insane, freaked out, or even dead." According to Tim, the person who replaced Paul was a man named William Shears Campbell, who had undergone cosmetic surgery to look like Paul. 4 months after Paul's supposed death in 1967, the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released. This opening track talks about a fictional band named Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club, and by the end of the track, we're introduced to a man named Billy Shears, or William Shears Campbell. The closing track, A Day in the Life, talks about a man who blew his mind out in a car, and was allegedly them referring to what happened to Paul. On the album cover, there's a hand above Paul's head, which was said to symbolize his death. The article noted that many believe is an ancient death symbol of either the Greeks or the American Indians. In one photo, Paul is wearing a black armband with the letters OPD, which apparently stood for Officially Pronounced Dead. On the Magical Mystery Tour album artwork, all 4 members are carrying roses. The other 3 have red roses, while Paul's is black. In the music video for the song Paperback Writer, the video has close-ups of the faces of each member. When the camera focuses on Paul, you can see a slight scar on his upper lip, which is presumably from the cosmetic surgery this look-alike had undertaken. 3 weeks later, the story made its way to Eastern Michigan University. A student named Tom called into Russ Gibb, a radio DJ in Michigan. He told him to play the song Revolution No. 9 backward. Recalling this moment, Russ Gibb said, "I should have brushed this kid off." He said, "Play the record backwards." I said, "What?" When I spun it backwards, it said, "Turn me on, dead man, turn me on, dead man." I freaked. On September 26th, the Beatles released their latest album at the time, Abbey Road. A student at the University of Michigan named Fred Laborde was asked to do a review of this album for a local paper, and decided to have a little fun. He published the article, "McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light," in the Michigan Daily. This was a tongue-in-cheek article where he didn't like the Abbey Road record and believed that this new album was proof that the Beatles had lost Paul. Labor finishes with, "The Beatles are building a mighty church, and when you emerge from it, you'll be laughing, for Paul is the Son of God." And below the article it reads, "The editor of the paper notes that Mr. Labor says it's all true, Mr. Labor." Eventually, Apple Records in London received a phone call where a publicist from the company had to confirm that Paul was not dead. On October 10th, Apple Records press officer Derek Taylor released a statement from Paul which said, "I'm alive and well," but this information fell on deaf ears. Instead, new theories emerged from the Abbey Road album. As you may know, the cover shows all four Beatles walking across a zebra crossing outside Abbey Road studios in London, but for some people, there's more to it than meets the eye. John is apparently dressed as the officiant at a funeral, Ringo as an undertaker, George as a gravedigger, and Paul is barefoot, signifying death. There's a Volkswagen Beetle on the road with a license plate 28IF, which refers to McCartney's supposed age if he had lived. And there are countless other things across the Beatles' audio and artwork that apparently indicate that Paul is dead. The conspiracy theory eventually made its way out of the Midwest. On WMCA radio, they took a call from a student at Hofstra University in Long Island, who was president of the Paul McCartney Dead Society. On October 20th, Roby Onge from the Detroit radio station WABC took two calls about the subject, one from Indiana and another from Georgia. Because of this show, the higher-ups at the station decided to take a show off the air for spreading misinformation. But as we all know, this was only going to fuel the conspiracy theory even further. Soon, a more mainstream radio station picked up the story. Contemporary Radio, a station owned by ABC, took up the story too and delivered this theory to an even bigger audience. Apple Records had to communicate again that Paul did not die, but obviously this had little or no effect again. Then the Chicago Sun-Times ran with, "Paul McCartney dead? Campuses swept by Beatle rumor." While all of this was happening, Paul McCartney, or the person allegedly posing as Paul McCartney, was living a fairly isolated life on a Scottish farm and had two small children to look after. Paul's wife Linda had just given birth to his daughter Mary, and this was the last thing they needed. Recalling this moment, Paul said, "I know all the rumors, because I was being asked about them. There would literally be someone ringing up to ask, 'Are you dead?' I said, 'Well, no, I'm answering this phone call.' And the reply would be, 'Well, I can't be sure if it's you.' So then, you actually do get a bit paranoid about yourself." And people from Apple Records were asking him to do something about it. Paul said in another interview, they said, "Look, what are you going to do about it? It's a big thing breaking in America. You're dead." And so I said, "Leave it. Just let them say it. It'll probably be the best publicity we've ever had, and I won't have to do a thing except stay alive." So I managed to stay alive through it. But when push came to shove, Paul decided to nip things in the bud. He had lived quite a surreal life up until then, but there's not much that could compare to what happened next. He gave a press conference to tell everyone that he wasn't dead. He said, "If the conclusion you reach is that I'm dead, then you're wrong, because I'm alive and living in Scotland." The other Beatles were also asked about this too. By this time, John Lennon was trying to promote his new band with Yoko Ono, and the very last thing he wanted to be asked about was Paul. Lennon said, "I don't know what Beatles records sound like backwards. I never play them backwards. They said I was wearing a white religious did Humphrey Bogart wear a white religious suit? All I've got is a nice Humphrey Bogart suit." Then on November 7th, Paul did an interview with Life magazine to set the record straight. He said, "It's all bloody stupid. I picked up that OPD badge in Canada. It was a police badge. Perhaps it meant Ontario Police Department or something. I was wearing a black flower because they ran out of red ones. It's John, not me, dressed in black on the cover and inside of Magical Mystery Tour. On Abbey Road, we were wearing our ordinary clothes. I was walking barefoot because it was a hot day. The Volkswagen just happened to be parked there." But with every conspiracy theory, there are certain grains of truth. Paul McCartney was actually involved in two accidents around the time he was alleged to have been killed. One of which was a motorcycle accident where he had a scar on his lip. And McCartney's Mini Cooper was involved in a crash during the icy winter of 1967, but the car was being driven by one of his friends, who survived the crash. Paul wasn't inside the vehicle when this happened. As well as grains of truth, there are also things people just simply made up. Fred later openly admitted that the name William Campbell was something he just came up with when writing the article. And the context of when this happened probably explained how this conspiracy theory made it this far. Recent events such as the controversial Vietnam War and the suspicious assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. in the US meant that people were less willing to go along with what the establishment press was telling them. Instead, people were more inclined to believe what their friends were telling them, rather than what was covered in the papers. As this article from X Radio outlines, 1969 was the year that the counterculture really hit its stride. The month before the story was published, hundreds of thousands of young people have gathered at Woodstock to preach peace in response to the ongoing war in Vietnam. Around the same time, the Isle of Wight Festival was taking place in the UK. Ultimately, this was the height of the hippie movement, and Paul may have found the root cause of why the story started and spread throughout colleges across the US. He said, "People may have taken too many drugs and started looking for answers in all the wrong places." The biggest argument to debunk this theory is Paul McCartney. He's gone on to make many critically acclaimed solo albums without any help from the other Beatles. And he's also gone on to father 5 children, who all seem to think he is Paul McCartney from the Beatles. If he isn't Paul McCartney, then you would really have to admire his commitment and talent to be able to replace him and perform and write just as good songs. Make sure to subscribe for more.